Go.
Hey guys, our last speaker for the night, keynote speaker, his name is Brian Burtch. He's going to be talking about challenging the re-urbanization of Indianapolis. He is a founder and owner of Neon Architecture. He'll be touching on concepts in neighborhood density, changes of our neighborhood for small, modest homes to unsustainable. That's a key word for the weekend. I need to get that down. For large single-family homes, and leave with a better understanding of how architectural design can help and reconstruct the diverse fabric of our neighborhoods. So let's bring it all together for Brian Burtch.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to participate in these conversations. It's really exciting to get the chance to share a little bit about Neon, a little bit about myself, and a little bit about our work. So as was mentioned, the topic of today's conversation is what we're calling the re-urbanization of Indianapolis. So I think, to jump into the presentation here, first off, though, I'd like to take a moment to give you all a little bit more background on myself and on Neon Architecture. So we are a small interdisciplinary practice in Indianapolis. We focus primarily on the design and construction of housing. So we are architects first, but more recently builders as well. So we've been in existence for about 6 years and are currently an office of 3, but soon to be an office of 5. And I think it's important just to mention that since the inception of Neon, we've worked really hard to focus our work and to focus our mission and to work to address issues in housing, whether it be size, location, efficiency, or price. And over these past 6 years, I think it's no mistake to mention that we've learned housing is really complicated. Housing in America is stagnant. It's often uninspired. And it's in desperate need of innovation, both on the design side, but also on the development and construction side. So first off, I want to step back for a minute and talk a little bit more about our city, about Indianapolis, and a little bit about its development history. And so here on the right-hand side, you see what's essentially a diagram of the boundaries of Center Township. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, you're looking at basically 38th Street on the north, Emerson on the east, Raymond on the south, and essentially the White River on the west. And I think it's important to look at this to frame the conversation about the development of our city over time in the 20th and 21st century primarily. So you'll see in the population statistics on the slide here, we really reached a peak of population density in Center Township around the 1950s. We were sitting at almost 350,000 people. And at that time, as was happening in cities across the country, we saw massive exodus, what we often call white flight, from the city to the suburbs. So, realistically in Indianapolis, from 1950 all the way until 2010, we saw population decline in Center Township. And we really bottomed out around 2010 at 142,000. So we lost almost 200,000 people in Center Township in 60 years. That's pretty significant. But then I think the interesting piece to briefly mention here is that in 2020, the population's gone up since 2010. So while it's still a small increase, we are starting to see a new wave of growth and development in our city. And I think it's important to understand that in the context of this conversation. So here we see an image of Indianapolis in the early 20th century. Obviously, it looks very different than it does today. What you'll kind of pay attention to is the fact that the city blocks are essentially fully developed. Buildings are lower, but buildings are more continuous. The fabric's more continuous. And you'll see that in these images here as well, where we have a smaller, medium density scale of development. And then on the right-hand side, you see the way that we as people occupied the city in the 1940s. And in many ways feels very different still than downtown does today. And I think, again, that's important as we frame the conversation moving forward. So the next piece I wanted to touch on is what's called Unigov. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Unigov was essentially the city's reaction to population decline in Center Township. So it was the consolidation of city and county governments, primarily focused on capturing more land. So this happened in 1970. And what it really did for the city, for better or for worse, and in some ways for development, I would absolutely say worse, it masked this population decline. So it kind of put a veil over the reality that we were hemorrhaging population in our city center because we essentially captured all of the townships into our population. So we were able to essentially maintain and actually increase population at that time. But what you can see in the statistic here is we went from 82 square miles to 442 square miles. So now we have a city, 5+ times the size it was previously that we now have to provide services to. So therein lies many of the problems we probably see today in terms of transit and access to sidewalks and infrastructure that we don't always have in places where we want and need it. So again, digging a little bit deeper into what Unigov means. So the population density in Center Township back in 1950 was almost 8,000 people per square mile, which is fairly dense for a Midwestern American city. But in 2020, we're sitting at 3,600 people per square mile. So even with the recent developments in downtown and the population growth in the last decade, we're still sitting significantly below the population density we were in the 1950s. And then further, the population density of the city overall is only 2,400 people per square mile. So because of Unigov, we captured a lot of what I would call more suburban areas, and it really brought down the overall population density of the city. And so these are just a few images to kind of paint the picture of what that era in our city looked like. We definitely had this reaction to population decline, and the idea was that we needed to somehow tear down and redevelop our city center, and at the expense of really a lot of really beautiful buildings. A lot of flat iron buildings. So in the top image, you see what would be Mass Ave being torn down. And then on the upper right, you see a new building going in where originally would have sat much smaller medium density buildings. And then we see Market Square Arena surrounded by a sea of parking lots. And then the city county building looming in the background of the original being torn down. So again, really painting a picture here of kind of the rapid loss of population and the kind of, overreaction of the city at that time, and maybe the wrong reaction. But again, as I mentioned, since 2010, we have started to see a population growth, and a population growth in Center Township in particular. And it just so happens that Neon started in this period. So Neon was founded in 2015. And I think because of that fact, we've come into the city at a really interesting time, a time where we are seeing a lot of new development and a lot of redevelopment of these neighborhoods. And because of that, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the previous characteristics of those neighborhoods, but also be mindful of, as we rebuild them or as we build new, what does that mean, and what might we do differently, or how might we consider things differently? So again, talking about Neon, I think it's important to start with our first project, which was the Neon House. And the Neon House is my own personal residence. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think for us, it was really important that the Neon House be a sort of case study. And we wanted it to represent the mission and the intentions of the firm very clearly. So, looking to build the Neon House, we sort of scoured the city to find a property that felt suitable for the project. And we fell in love with Fountain Square. And we fell in love with Fountain Square just prior to the Fountain Square development that we see currently. So right before all the new restaurants we all know, And honestly, before the flippers and the spec builders kind of overtook the residential fabric of the neighborhood. And so we were able to find a small lot. And we fell in love with the lot because of the challenge it presented. And so the lot that the Neon House is built on is 21 and a half feet wide and only 70 feet deep, and sits on the edge of Fountain Square right next to the highway. And the reason, honestly, I fell in love with it was because of the size constraints it presented. For me and for Neon, it's really important to talk about issues of scale and the spaces of the homes we live in. And for me, this property presented the reality that we weren't going to be able to build a big house. We had to build within the constraints of the property. So as we began to work on the design process, really quickly realized that the zoning code was problematic. And it was particularly problematic to this project. As you can see here on the slide, we hit a number of snags on the zoning code, whether it was open space requirements, whether it was street frontage, whether it was minimum square footages, whether it was setbacks or parking requirements. None of these pieces met this property. The property didn't meet those demands. So as we're designing this, we're realizing that the city's zoning code is essentially telling us that an existing city parcel that used to have a house on it no longer meets the building requirements for the city and is unfit for a house. So we're kind of sitting there scratching our heads going, how is that possible? How are we purchasing an existing parcel in the city, but yet the zoning code is essentially saying you can't build anything on here? So lo and behold, we go through the process, and basically what has to happen there is we have to go through a series of variances to get the house built. And for us, it was a really good learning moment. And the realization there that came out of that project was that the city zoning code actively prohibits us from recreating or building Indianapolis the way it used to be. So a lot of our older urban neighborhoods exist at a scale that the zoning code doesn't properly acknowledge. And this project presented that to us very clearly. So these are just a few images for reference of the Neon House. So again, it's situated on a very narrow lot. And part of the case study was just demonstrating the capability of a small property. So maximizing interior space, exploring alternative methods of construction, modular construction here. And then also looking at ways to really take advantage of small pockets of outdoor space with chicken coops and vegetable gardens. And again, really proving that a lot can be done with a little. And so following the Neon House, we took this up as an opportunity to step back for a minute and to really dig into the city's zoning code and to look at what it means, why it exists, and what it does. And I think, as you start to look at it more and more closely, you start to see realities that exist. And you start to see this reality that the zoning code becomes one of the most powerful tools for neighborhoods to exclude development and people. We oftentimes, when we hear a project presented in certain areas, we oftentimes hear neighbors come back and say that it's inappropriate, it will jeopardize the character of the neighborhood, and there's this idea about preservation, when oftentimes those arguments are hiding the fact of potentially, racist and discriminatory feelings and behaviors that we often see. And that's the reality we exist in. And the reality for us is that projects of any level of uniqueness really appear to require variances or special approvals. And the reality of this is that this is not an easy process. It's expensive, it's complicated, it's time consuming, and it's all of those things for us that are in the profession, let alone the homeowner or individual who's looking to build or develop something. So we really quickly realized that the zoning code has been heavily influenced by outside players and those who have different intentions and motivations than we do. And so what we see more recently in our city is a series of big buildings being built by big developers. neighbors, and that's not a coincidence. But what that does is it really starts to take away from what we see in the earlier slides of Indianapolis and this kind of medium scale density that's really appealing in many ways. And again, kind of a side tangent here, talking about that scale of density and doing a little bit more digging, we found a really lovely quote kind of talking more about those neighborhoods and those, medium density neighborhoods around cities across the United States. And I'd like to read it here just to kind of paint that picture. What we want is, well, the entire old housing stock of the city. The trouble is not that we don't recognize it, but that we can't reproduce it. People want to live in New York's West Village, San Francisco's North Beach, Philadelphia's Society Hill. They're drawn to the right kind of density. Harlem has been expensively reoccupied by urban professionals because the streets and the housing stock of Harlem, paralyzed by prejudice for so long, are intrinsically appealing to anyone who has the chance to live there. It's not a taste for the retro or mere nostalgia that makes this happen. It is a recognition that the building habits of times past created spaces that are more hospitable than the sterility of the time present. And this is from Adam Gopnik of the New Yorker. And I think what he really does here is he paints a picture of some of just the reasons we fall in love with certain places. So this is a photo of New York's West Village. And I think it's important just to kind of acknowledge the diversity of uses, the diversity of scales, and the diversity of building types. There's something really human about the scale of the place. And I think it's important to kind of think about that in the context of zoning codes. So related to that, but a little bit different, it is the conversation of single family zoning. So single family zoning is a use zoning in city zoning codes. So basically what it does is you take a parcel of land and you assign a use to it, a use that you're allowed to occupy on it. So what you see here in these diagrams of various cities, New York, Charlotte, and San Jose, the pink being single family zoning, you start to see a reality here. And I put New York on here only because New York is an anomaly in American city development. So you can see that the pink is very small in New York. So New York has a very small amount of single family zoning. The blue is other types of housing zoning. And then in Charlotte, the pink starts to consume the city. And then in San Jose, the housing zoning classification is almost entirely single family zoning. And so you might be asking, well, what's the problem with this? But the problem really becomes that single family zoning is very specific. It's very limiting. It doesn't allow for multiple uses and it doesn't allow for multiple buildings. So Indianapolis is no exception to this. The majority of our city is single family zoned. And while we have made some improvements in the zoning code recently with the allowance of secondary dwelling units, we're largely still limited by the realities of single family zoning. And so what you see as a result of single family zoning and also white flight and the suburbanization of our cities, you see that our houses get bigger, our properties get more expensive, and we lose home ownership. So the statistics on the screen here, since the 1970s, the average American home has increased almost 1,000 square feet. And more locally, the average Indianapolis home price has increased $60,000 in the last 3 years. And for an affordable housing market like Indianapolis, that's a very significant number. And it's no coincidence that single family zoning exists in that context, because when you have single family zoning, you have less land, you have less homes. When the market is active, things become expensive quickly. And then the other piece of that equation is this home ownership rate. And I'm sure many of us are aware, but millennials have the lowest home ownership rate of many, many recent generations. So we're seeing a significant decline in home ownership. And there's a lot of reasons why that exists, but these are absolutely contributing factors to that reality. So after processing all of this reality, after processing the single family zoning challenges, being a small practice, we took it as an opportunity to find a way to challenge it. And I think it's important to note that a small residential firm, residential practices in general, typically operate where clients come to them with projects and then the architects design those projects that they ask for. But I think because seeing the neon house, I think sort of demonstrates that we don't necessarily always want to operate that way. We believe that as architects and as builders, responsibility to be more proactive in the types of projects we work on and the types of developments that we push for. So after seeing the realities of the zoning and this sort of density and affordability issue, we presented some new ideas, and we looked for some new ideas here. And that's where Bevel Greens comes into play here. So, Bevel Greens is a new project for us. It's been ongoing for a few years now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think, just a little bit of context on what Bevel Greens is and what Bevel Greens represents. So again, we started thinking we started the design conversation looking at different site strategies and really beginning to think about how we could occupy residential property in a slightly different way, but also understanding the context of Indianapolis. So in this image, you'll see on the top right-hand side, Washington Court, which is a small collection of homes located just west of Washington Boulevard and 32nd Street. And essentially all of the homes are organized around a green space with alleys on the periphery. And then in the bottom right-hand side, you see Audubon Court, which is 2 rows of townhouses facing each other with community green space down the middle in Irvington. And then on the left-hand side, you see various bungalow courts of Southern California, Pasadena, and Los Angeles. And after reviewing these concepts and precedents, we really fell in love with the bungalow court typology. And I think, the reason that was the case is it allowed us to still produce the single family home model, but to do it in a way that opened up opportunities for community engagement, integration of nature into the development, and still kind of finding a way to weave within the existing fabric of the city. So after settling on the bungalow court, we stepped back again for a minute and went through a series of neighborhood engagement processes where we talked to various organizations, various community development corporations, various neighborhood associations and organizations to really get a good sense of the fabric of the Near East Side where the project will be built. To understand the neighbors, to understand the existing housing stock, and to understand how this project may fit in. And so here's an image of the Bevel Greens development from the street. And as you'll see, it's essentially 6 single-family homes organized around a central green space. And so to put this development in context, these 6 homes are situated on what was originally 2 city parcels that originally housed 1 single-family home on each parcel. So the proposal here takes 2 lots that have been vacant for probably 20 years and says, let's put 6 homes on instead of 2, because we need to be a little bit more mindful of the development patterns and the affordability issues that this neighborhood and others around it are starting to see. So each of these homes contains their own private garden space, while also having strong connections to that communal space. So in the diagram here, you can see some of the additional features and amenities of the development, because I think it's really important as we work through the design here, we were really mindful of sustainability in terms of the footprint of the home, the size of the homes, the quality and the efficiency of the homes, looking at renewable energy for each and every home, as well as the landscape strategies, stormwater strategies, and again, this community piece, which is really, really important to us. And this is a site plan of the development. And again, I think the thing to really point out here is the scale of the green space and the community space in the context in relation to the home space. And so the reality for a development like this is we're achieving 27 units per acre while still maintaining this significant amount of open space. And I think the 27 units per acre is important to touch on for a minute. So previous to this development, as I mentioned, these were 2 city parcels, and they were zoned D5, which is a specific type of residential zoning in Indianapolis, which typically results in around 5 units per acre. And as part of that D5 zoning, you're required to have 60% of the property be open space. So only 40% of it can be built on. And so in our development, we're able to build at a level of 27 units per acre, adding 22 units new per acre over the typical 5 units per acre for D5, but we're still able to exceed the 60% open space. So for us, that was really, really exciting. For us, that was a demonstration that we can build density while still maintaining open space, and while also still being able to kind of bring nature in, allow for those community engagements to happen. And I think really kind of start to flip the model of what does it mean to be dense, but also still allow for that space between. And I think that's a really great model for a place like Indianapolis, where we're not used to lots and lots of density. So here's, just for context, a few images of the floor plans. So on the left-hand side is the basement level, the middle is the first floor, and the right-hand side is the second floor. And again, I think it's important to point out these homes are small, but that's intentional. And I think that's how we achieve the appropriate level of density while still having that open space. And again, acknowledging the realities of the housing industry and the real estate kind of control on the market. We wanted to make sure that these homes checked the boxes that people still look for. So we're able to fit 3 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, adequate living space, kitchen space, and all of those pieces that are really important to us as homeowners in a very, very small footprint. So then, after going through all this design process, the reality is now that none of this fits the zoning code. So how do we get a project like this approved through the city when it doesn't check any of the boxes of the zoning code? So we have to take it to the city, we present it to the city, and we have to have conversations with the city planners. And we really, really quickly realized that the city planners were not on board. They were not interested in this project happening, and they went so far as to recommend denial to the Planning Commission. So these are just some quotes I won't read in detail, but these were some of the reactions of the city planning department to the project. Essentially, they were arguing that it was out of context with the neighborhood, it was detrimental to the neighborhood, and they were advocating for the replacement of 2 single-family homes. But again, seeing some of the statistics earlier, I think it's important to, again, remind ourselves that we have a home ownership issue, we have an affordability issue, and I frankly don't think we can afford to put 2 single-family homes back there. So the reality for us was that we had to push back on the city planners, and we had to push the project forward anyway, in spite of the planning department's recommendation. So we went back to our neighborhood organizations, we went back to the community development corporations, and we asked them to show up at the public hearing to support us and to support the project, because they all believed in it. They are there in the neighborhoods firsthand, and they see the challenges the neighborhood faces. And so we were able to go to the public hearing and present the project in opposition to the planning staff and able to gain approval. And I think, again, it's important to kind of reflect on that for a moment and realize the time and money and effort that goes into a project like that, and just into getting it approved, let alone getting it built. And we had the privilege and the ability to take that time and to take that responsibility on, because it was really important to us. But again, that's just the first step in the process, honestly. All the neighborhood work, all of the approval work, now we're at the reality that we have to figure out how to build it. And I think this is another really important piece to talk about when we talk about housing and we talk about development in cities. We're a really small firm, and we're not a developer. And we have a partner on the project, but he's also not a developer. He's a passionate individual who cares about the mission of the project. So what that means is we can't just simply overnight flip a switch and start development. We have to find the finances to build the project. And then that presents this whole new layer of challenges. And that reality is really comes down to third-party opinions on your project, which we've already seen over and over again with the city. So that's where the appraisal process comes into play, which essentially means we take our design and our budgets that we've worked on and we hand them over to somebody else, and we allow them to review and decide whether the project is worth what we say it's worth. And for us, that's a little bit of a slap in the face, honestly, after all the energy and effort we put into it, to hand that over to somebody else and to say, let me talk to realtors, let me look at comparable homes, and let me decide whether we think this is a viable project. And the important piece, I think, to also hit on there is the comparable home piece. When you go through an appraisal process, an appraiser looks to the neighborhood and to the surrounding context to what they call comps, which is essentially finding examples of similar projects that have been sold previously. And so for a project like Bevel Greens, where we're asking to build a collection of homes that doesn't exist in that neighborhood, an appraiser can't find a comp. So they can't find a similar home to reference in terms of the market value of the home. So I think, really quickly you realize that there's inherent flaws in the process that inhibit innovation in the housing development industry. Now, if we had unlimited cash, we could probably circumvent some of those, but the reality is we don't. So we have to go through those processes. Lucky enough, we did our homework and we made sure we were very aware that process was going to happen, and we were able to essentially get through the appraisal process. But now we're still at the point where we're waiting on the bank to decide how to finance the build. And the reality there is when a bank sees a project like this, even if they have, good partners in that process, they still see it as a risky venture because there's no proven market for it. Even though all of the statistics are pointing towards the need for something new and something different, they don't have a previous track record of development, so they don't know how to respond to it. And so I think one little slight victory for us in the meantime, while we're working through the financing piece, is the reality that this project has already been referenced and included in nearby neighborhood quality of life plans as a model for development in our neighborhoods for increasing density. So it's exciting to know that neighborhoods are catching on, and they're excited and acknowledging that we have to think differently about housing. We have to think differently about how we occupy our land, and we have to think differently about how we build back our neighborhoods. And I also think, just talking about the appraisal process, I wanted to briefly kind of step back for a minute and talk about this reality of the market and who controls the market and who controls the zoning and who controls the process. And I think in America, we've seen this problem, not just in the housing industry, but many industries where sort of corporatization takes over. And there's a really great geographer, Samuel Stein, who's involved in development, and he calls it the real estate state. And essentially what he's talking about is the fusion of development and politics. And so we get to this point in American history where we abandon public housing and we abandon the government providing housing to the people, and we put it on the private industry. And what happens is the private industry gets so fused with the political sphere that now we see the influence of the private industry on politics, which then translates into zoning and development. And so the reality here is that when that happens, we see exploitation for profit. And I think, 2021, we're seeing it at an all-time high. And this is not an Indianapolis problem. This is a global problem. The reality here is that the real estate industry is a massive profit venture. And you can see here that the global real estate market is worth $217 trillion now. And that's 36 times the value of all the gold ever mined in the history of the world. And 75% of the world's wealth is now tied up in housing. And we are seeing a new way of developers and investors just kind of treating housing as a commodity instead of as a right and as a need. And I think, unfortunately, what happens when we see that is we see the rapid decline in home ownership. And what's really interesting when you look at that is who buys property now and who owns homes. And so home ownership is at a 50-year low in the United States. And recently, 37% of all home sales were made to absentee investors. So what that means is banks, hedge funds, private equity firms are basically buying up our homes, taking away the possibility of individuals owning homes. And again, it's an overwhelming reality. I think there's so many nuances to the housing market and the housing world. And again, as a small practice, you kind of start to step back and go, well, what can we even do? So we step back and we look at little realities in our own city. And I think for us, it's the suburban mentality infiltrating the redevelopment and really kind of changing the types of homes we're seeing built and the scale of homes we're seeing built. And I think we all know that we need to see a change and we need new ideas. We can't afford to stay on the same path of development, and we can't afford to, our planet can't afford to have us move on that path. So we need to look for new solutions and new ideas. But again, the barrier to entry is incredibly high when you have giant real estate equity firms controlling the development market. But we owe it to ourselves and to our communities to push back and to push for new ideas. So I briefly wanted to touch on some other developments, and one in particular that I think are really promising and really inspirational as we hope to develop Bevel and start to really focus where Neon goes next. And so there's a really exciting developer in Australia, Nightingale Housing, and they've developed a really interesting housing model where they're acknowledging that developers have to participate in the market, but they can be a different kind of developer. And make no mistake, it's been incredibly challenging for them, but also still really successful. So their model, I would say in simple terms here, well, let's talk about their quote first, and then I'll give some characteristics. So they ask in the first development for Nightingale, how can we build a well-designed community-led building for owner-occupiers, not investors? Following the German Baugruppen movement, the solution was to change the financial model behind developments, including using equity investors to raise funds and placing a cap on profits so that there were no corners cut in the build itself. So essentially, they're acknowledging the reality of the real estate development world and needing to change that. And so when you look at Nightingale's projects, which they have a number already completed and a significant number currently in development, which means their model is starting to catch on. And just a few key characteristics of what they do and how they do it. So the first thing is they really talk a lot about building less to give more. And what that means is they look at your individual housing units and they find ways to pare back on things we don't necessarily need in order to give you more quality, more efficiency, better access to light, better materials, better comfort, those sorts of things. They also are 100% carbon neutral, so they're incredibly mindful of the environment. They're also dense, and they really consider that as they develop. And the other piece that happens, because they take all of the things we don't necessarily need out, they have the ability to make a higher quality product more affordable. And the other piece that I think is really, really interesting when you talk about the real estate market is they've changed the model of how they price their units. So because of the taking out of extra unnecessary amenities, they're able to reduce the sale price. But then what happens is if you ever do end up selling your unit in one of their projects, you have a series of restrictions that are put upon you. And that's really to ensure the long-term sustainability of these kinds of developments. And so the first right of refusal comes into play if you sell, which means that their community purchaser list has first access to the unit, and they build that list as they develop their projects. The second reality is they cap the resale price, which essentially is the price you pay plus a small markup based on the median home price of the neighborhood the project is in. Additionally, they're very mindful of who lives in their units, and they reserve a certain number of units towards community housing partners. And also they have a priority ballot policy that gives preferential treatment to individuals with disabilities, indigenous communities, et cetera. And so I think looking at that model and looking at how they operate on the market really gives us kind of a really promising lens forward for navigating the realities of the market, the realities of the zoning code, but also understanding that we as individuals, as architects, as builders, as developers, as citizens, kind of have to take back that development model and make our own rules. We have to make our own rules to, I think, push for the new ideas that we want to see, because I think we've seen that the government's not necessarily going to handle it for us, and the large-scale development firms aren't going to do it either. So if we want to see that change, we have to take on that responsibility ourselves. And so I just put here on the slide just a few other ideas about housing and different methods of housing. And I think the big thing to point out in all of these models here, including Big Car's model locally, is we really think about how these all think about how we occupy land a little bit differently, how we occupy space differently, and how we prioritize community a little bit differently as well. So I think those all go hand in hand. And I think they're all models that we should be looking at for really kind of challenging the way and pushing the way our city redevelops in a more promising and equitable way. So again, thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity. And I think we have plenty of time for questions. So happy to answer whatever we might have.
Awesome. Can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, that was fantastic. So much awesome stuff. So while, everyone, like always, throw your questions in the chat or the Q&A section. We've got a couple to kick us off. Danny, I think you had one.
Yeah. So actually, I'd like to start you off with a compliment that I saw in the chat from Caleb Larson, who compared what I think you're talking about at the time was the Bevel Greens to Indiana's version of Usona. And I'm not totally sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but if you could familiarize that term to us in the audience.
Sure. So Usonia or Usonian houses is a Frank Lloyd Wright concept in terms of, and basically Frank Lloyd Wright's idea was well-designed, modest homes for the masses. So essentially what we see in Frank Lloyd Wright, like sort of later in his career, trying to address the same issues we're talking about. So I think, it's flattering that we could refer that to, reference Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonia to our project. But yeah, I think in many ways, that's kind of where we're at as a practice, is trying to find ways to create unique, sustainable, middle-class housing solutions. And that's almost exactly what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing with his Usonian houses.
Yeah, and I know you can't see the chat, so I'll just continue to talk about what Danny was talking about. Like, everyone is really loving this. Nightingale sounds incredible. Preferential treatment to indigenous communities, lots of claps around that. Build less, give more with a heart. Everyone here, I think, is like really, really feeling this.
Good.
So what's the next big thing? I know you guys have some hurdles to get through still for the main one. I'm already blanking on the name.
Yeah, Bevel Greens. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that one. Are you guys looking to, once that's complete, continue to build that out and in that kind of format throughout Indianapolis?
I would say yes, ideally. I think the reality for us is we know that, we feel so strongly about the concept that if we can get it built, people will want to replicate it. And I think we'll want to replicate it as well. So I think for us, again, we were architects first, and now we're builders and sort of now developers. So we're taking on a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, which is slow and a little bit overwhelming at times. But I think we chip away one project at a time. So I would say absolutely we want to do more of that. I mean, we still do single family homes because we still love that too. But even in each of those projects, we're asking those kinds of questions too.
Yeah, makes sense. And hopefully the next time you guys go through this, it'll be a little bit easier.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think for me, like the Nightingale project is really inspiring for us to think more about not just how we develop land and not just about density, but how we think about how the neighbors own that land, what they own versus what they don't own. And that's, I don't know where that will take us, to be honest. Maybe it will push us down another path of creating our own development company. I have no idea, but it's definitely a possibility.
We love open-ended possibilities. I think that's what design is all about, right?
That's right. Yeah, totally.
What you mentioned with projects continuing and density specifically, I wrote down in my notes, one of the key takeaways that I had was that I loved when you mentioned a neighborhood in New York, and I'm blanking on its name, of course, because I was focused on the content, that it's the layering of buildings and activities that's what makes neighborhoods feel human. And I was relating it back to this suburbanism sprawl that's just literally flattening human lifestyles, and we're not seeing that type of layering as much anymore, especially in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's, not to beat on the zoning code, but so much of it comes down to that, even in terms of how we redevelop. So, we see it all the time where we look at our neighborhoods and we have 90% of the neighborhood is single family zoning. And then this tiny little commercial strip has commercial zoning, probably not even mixed use. And so what happens is you lose those really beautiful layering of not just buildings, but uses. Think about like pockets of New York or even little pockets of India where you get, a corner grocery store or a random little restaurant or cafe on a corner surrounded by townhouses or even single family homes sometimes, and how interesting that moment is and how we all love that moment, but then we can't do it. We can't build it. So I think we know that. It's baffling sometimes when we see that we can't do it, even though we know that the planners probably know that.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in from the chat as well. So Madison Stephen asks, what are your thoughts about communal living and co-housing? Makes her think of Denmark and Happy documentary and personal benefits of living in a community.
Yeah, so I think, it's obviously a little privilege for me to support co-housing when I live in my own house, but I really do think that it's going to be a significant part of the housing solution. You think about co-housing, it's very much like college dorm housing in a way, where maybe you have ownership of a space, but you share a lot of the common uses, kitchens, laundry facilities, those sorts of things. And I think it's it's really exciting in a way, because you think about something I've been critical of with the suburban mentality infiltrating our city is we've kind of lost the neighbor to neighbor connection. And I'm guilty of it too. But I think when you think about those kinds of housing models, you really start to think about it's sort of a forced interaction in a way. And I hate to say that, like we're forcing people to engage, but I think you end up with really strong connections and you build your own little sense of community just in those kinds of developments. So I think they'll take time to catch on here because of the sprawl we have. People are so used to living in their own space, but I really do think that there's probably an interest and a intrigue in that kind of model.
I tend to think so. Like, it's almost like we have to retrain our neighborhoods to be neighborly and like force people to go get cups of sugar from the house next door.
So true.
Yeah, I think another thing just to mention on the co-housing side, though, is, I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but California recently purchased, kind of due to the pandemic and the relief, they've purchased, I don't even remember, an insane amount of hotel inventory to house homeless. So basically, they're creating transitional housing in hotels through pandemic relief funding. And those are essentially co-housing developments. And so I think when you look at those kinds of alternative housing models, you really quickly realize that we could be addressing a lot of serious issues with them first, and then maybe they expand further into other markets.
That would be really interesting. I haven't read about that one, but I'm definitely gonna look that up.
Yeah, it just happened. It just happened recently. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would love to read more about that between now and trivia.
Yeah.
Your lovely husband has prompted us with a question.
Is this a softball?
This might be a softball. But it got 2 thumbs up, so I'm gonna softball to you.
Great.
What kind of areas in Indianapolis would be unbuildable today?
Gosh. So I think, when you say unbuildable, you would look at immediately it's like any obscure lot. So like our house, for example, while it was zoned residential, it was too small to meet the zoning code requirements. So any of those kinds of parcels would be unbuildable. But I think, when you start talking about any other alternative development strategies that don't check the single family box, you could argue that a majority of the city is unbuildable, which is kind of absurd because in reality, the majority of the city is buildable and was already built on. So that's not even getting into, industrial issues and brownfields and remediation that has to happen with those. But yeah, I think, that could take me on a whole tangent about like the use piece. And I think the mixed use reality that we need to have in neighborhoods and like flexibility of space and flexibility of use. But I won't go too far.
I think Joy might have been setting you up for that one.
We've got one more in here. So do you think Bevel Green was difficult to get approved because it is not quite traditional single family homes, nor the typical multifamily development? Are there any other examples, even vague, similar in Indy?
So there are actually a handful of examples in Indy that are almost identical. So there's a development at like 29th and Broadway. That's 6 bungalows, 3 facing 3. That's probably from the 1920s. Washington Court, I mentioned earlier, is I think 6 or 8 single family homes, all facing a common green space. So I think what it is yes, that's true, because they're kind of like quasi single family, but not that the city didn't necessarily know how to respond to them. But I honestly think in some ways, back to the Unigov piece, is the city is so big and the planning staff is so small. A part of me just thinks they don't want to deal with challenging zoning issues because they don't have the time or the energy for it. I would say we were baffled by the critique that it was detrimental to the neighborhood. And that really struck a chord with us. We're trying to build a project that would be the absolute opposite. And I think even in early neighborhood meetings, we had a couple neighbors who painted it as though we were trying to maximize our profit by building as many homes as we could, which is absolutely not the case. So you're always going to have a bit of that, but I think it's just they're not used to like different organizations of housing and different ways to occupy land in mid-block developments. But I don't know why not, because literally we were almost surrounded by vacant lots on that property. So
yeah, right. People always fear what they don't know or understand. So you never know.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, not seeing any other ones in the chat. Any other questions from you, Danny?
not without getting too heavy, and it would probably prompt another like 10-minute discussion. I want to be mindful next time.
Well, any final thoughts from you, Brian, before we wrap it up here?
No, I think the only thing, honestly, I talked about Indianapolis, but I talked about American cities as well. And you start researching more and more into these issues, and you start realizing that the challenges are bigger and bigger and bigger, whether it's construction or whether it's development and density and affordability. So I think, for me, it's learning that the United States has a lot of work. We have a lot of work to do. We aren't where other countries are, honestly. I think we give ourselves a lot of free passes. But when it comes to housing, I think we all know that we have serious issues to tackle. And I think Indianapolis is a place where if we were to open ourselves up to that reality and kind of really open up the development opportunity with restrictions and with some sort of control, because obviously developers could consume that, we could really quickly position ourselves as a city in a really, really promising and exciting way. And I think that's always the thing we struggle with as any creative individual in the city is there's so much potential here, but we always hit these roadblocks. And I would really encourage us all to challenge our own neighborhoods and city councilors to really push for these kinds of ideas, push for us to challenge the zoning and the planning and the development, because I think we're not far off and we could have some really exciting things happen.
Yeah, for you, and for sure. And we've got people like you fighting the good fight, and we're really happy to have you and be able to share that message with everyone that's watching.
Yeah,
we really want that for Indy as well. So
absolutely. We do have one more question that snuck in at the end that I didn't notice, and it trails off really nicely with what you said. Sumesh is asking, what kinds of things can community members do that would alleviate some of these hurdles that are preventing the rethinking of housing and land use? What would your ideal civic structure for planning land use look like?
Oh man, I think the first step, is we all know that politics plays a big role in the process, and I think I often forget that myself. So I think it's first off, holding our own city councilors accountable to help change the process, change the hurdles, and be on our side. So we were lucky in the Bevel Greens development. We had Zach Adamson as our counselor, and he was in full support of it. He came to the hearing in support. But those are the realities we need when we push those kinds of projects. And I think in terms of the civic structure for planning and land use, I don't know. I think so. The city had a rezoning in 2016, and they added a lot of good uses and a lot of changes to the code, but then none of those uses were actually implemented. So they added all these mixed use zoning classifications, but they didn't rezone anything. So in order to get a mixed use zoning, you have to still go and get your property rezoned, which is mind boggling. Like the whole reality of the mixed use zoning should be to go ahead and blanket rezone certain things, certain areas, certain districts. And so I think, the civic structure for planning and land use, I don't know if you could do it at the neighborhood level. I mean, it sounds really great, but also incredibly terrifying to just say like, hey, here, let the neighbors decide the land use. But in some ways, I do think that process needs a little bit to be more engaging with the neighborhoods, because especially neighborhoods that have seen significant disinvestment, letting them decide, hey, what do we want to do? Not even like what to do, but like what can be done here. Maybe that's something we should consider, is let the neighbors say what the use should be or what the use could be. Not should be, but could be.
I like that. I think that's a really good action item to wrap up on.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your time and giving us the last hour plus of your time to us.
Yeah, happy to.
When I should be saying Indie Design Week. Thank you.
Yeah, where can people find you if they're looking for more or to connect?
Yeah, so you can find us on Instagram at Neon Architecture. That's probably the best place, or neonarchitecture.com. And feel free to, reach out, comment, all that good stuff. And thank you all again for inviting me to be here. It's really great to get a chance to, spew my thoughts and get my thoughts out there and share a little bit of what we're doing. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And the normies.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Woo!
Welcome back to the normies.
Awesome. What's up, everybody?
What's up? I hope you guys had a great day. We're going to be ending today, but watch out for trivia night tonight. Sorry. I just want to thank everyone for joining us from their house and happy to enjoy your time and learn something new. I do want to thank SEP and Salesforce for sponsoring this wonderful event. And I also want to thank. Oh, we are at SEP? Yeah. Oh, so this wonderful facility is SEP. Yeah, so thank you guys for letting us use the space. And I also want to thank IndyDesign for letting us normies MC the event. It was a wonderful time. I had a great time. Hopefully, we learned something new about design. So that was really awesome.
Well, hey guys, the keynote speeches might be over, but the fun is going to continue. We got a trivia game planned for you guys. Hey, how well do you know the city? Come show your stuff in the networking space, and you can compete for cluster truck gift cards. We got 50% off merch.
What?
So go check it out, man. And also, if you are interested in a job, there's going to be hiring opportunities tomorrow at 9 a.m. in the same networking space. So come here bright and early.
Yeah.
You might land yourself a career, man. Or girl. So anyways, guys, it's been a fantastic day. Join us for more. Come back here bright and early and go play some trivia. Have a great night.